think the education savings accounts, or education freedom accounts, as they're called in New Hampshire, is the best way to go forward. And a high amount, like close to what would have been spent in the public schools, near $19,000, would be the best way to do it, in my view. And this would kind of help with the problem you addressed to Tim DeRoche about rural areas, because with the traditional voucher type of program, that can only be used for private school tuition and fees in most states. But with education freedom accounts, you can use the funding for non-brick and mortar type of school scenarios, so that you would be able to access more options like pandemic pods and micro schools, which don't require the same amount of capital investments as a brick and mortar private school. But I think Tim was also right that just because your area may not have a lot of private schools right now, if everybody had the funding tied to the student, you'd have a much different outlook of types of schools that exist. Maybe they're smaller schools, and maybe they're a mix of brick and mortar versus these pandemic pod types of arrangements. But I think the options would be there. And then look, the worst case scenario that's being imagined with the question of the rural area is that there's no change. If there aren't as many choices in rural areas, then you might not have as much movement. But I expect, as Tim said earlier, that there would be different alternatives available. I wanted to hit something else someone said about accountability. Let's face it, private schools and charter schools face the strongest form of accountability there is, which is accountability to their customers, accountability to families. If the school does a bad job, families can take their children's education dollars elsewhere and vote with their feet. So they have a strong bottom-up set of incentives, a form of accountability to do the right thing for their families. The way that I've put it millions of times before is that underperforming private schools shut down, underperforming district schools get more money. The set of incentives is completely backwards in the traditional system, because they can always go back to the voter and back to the government and say, we're failing because we need more money. But in the charter and private school sector in general, if they do a bad job and people vote with their feet away, their schools must shut down. And so they have to shape up and improve. And with school choice, this leads to improvements in the public school sector as well, because that set of incentives changes. In fact, there are 28 studies nationwide that look at the effects of private school choice competition on the students who remain in the public school system. 26 of the 28 studies find positive effects on student outcomes from school choice competition in the public school system. So school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats because of that competitive pressure as well. That's mostly what I wanted to hit on. And yeah, I talked a little bit about the education freedom accounts. One other thing that was said earlier was about the NAEP rankings in New Hampshire. They're not at the top if you control for student demographic characteristics. I'll put it into the chat in a second, but the Urban Institute has something called America's Gradebook. And they took the 2019 latest NAEP results from the nation's report card. And after controlling for free and reduced lunch students and different background characteristics of the students, New Hampshire is actually in the bottom half of states on 8th grade math and reading outcomes. But I don't think the argument for school choice really, it's not really tied to how the public schools are doing. If the public school is doing a good job, they won't lose a lot of students, and families should still be able to pick the public schools no matter how they're ranked nationally. So I also want to be clear that in the proposal to fund students directly, the public school should absolutely still be an option that's on the table, but people shouldn't be forced, as Tim said, into a particular institution regardless of their choice. And let's face it, the least advantaged are the ones that are most likely to be stuck because of these government lines that are drawn. And the most advantaged are the ones that are more likely to be able to move houses or to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. I would like for more families to be able to access these alternatives.